Looking and thinking like you're doing a line drawing with a pencil can sometimes be beneficial. In line drawing, you have to describe volume somehow, and often it's going to be with overlapping lines. Around joints, overlapping lines become very useful and beneficial to describe plane as well and plane change. The same thing can be true in sculpture, as overlaps are created visually by one form sitting in front of another. So it's not the same as on paper where it's an illusion, but we create overlaps in sculpture by having the illusion take place in space, of course. The amount of this occurring is higher around joints, though it does happen all over the body, of course. Creating overlaps where one part of a joint travels across the joint and into the next part of a limb is really important to create a convincing connection between the two parts of a limb. Notice here how this form travels across the joint of the elbow and into the upper arm, therefore connecting the two and making motion and mobility seem like a possibility. The reason this works, of course, is because for a joint to actually function in real life, a muscle originating at one part of the limb, let's say the upper part of the limb, has to travel across the joint to the other part of the limb, let's say the lower part of the limb, and attach there for motion to be possible. Muscles are levers that impart movement by traveling across the joints. Look for similar evidence around any joint, and you will be making more convincing joints rather quickly. I want to take a second here and look at something that any sculptor using the technique of observation on equal terms should consider, and depending on the complexity of the pose, will eventually have to contend with. Here we have a fairly standard pose, but you will have noticed that at some point here I rotated the sculpture to an angle that is not quite in line with the rest of the views we observed from. In this sculpture, the balance leg is aimed at a 3/4 angle in relationship to the front plane of the pelvis. And we did of course use the front plane of the pelvis to begin our observation on equal terms from. Then we moved in 90 degrees increments from that front plane of the pelvis. But in a scenario where an element, usually a limb or the portrait, is aimed in a different direction and it makes more sense to observe said element on equal terms on its own, separate from the rest of the figure, then I try to do it. For the balance leg, I'm usually going to consider the front of the knee as the front plane of the balance leg, so the front view, if you will. And the side views, therefore, are 90 degrees to the front of the knee, and the back view is 180 degrees to the front view, of course. So the back of the knee, essentially. Doing so has, in my experience, been very helpful, since the contours end up belonging to forms that they ought to belong to, instead of having the contours built in random spots on the forms, which doesn't always make too much sense. If you observe the balance leg on equal terms on its own, you are much more likely to build contours on the balance leg or for the balance leg that mirror the placement of the contours you built for the standing leg. This is much easier to deal with later when it comes to modeling and turning the form, which all the contour work we do will eventually lead us to, of course. If we work on the balance leg on the contours of the balance leg while observing from the front of the pelvis like we have with everything else, then we will build contours in places where the forms will really struggle to turn properly. The same thing is true when it comes to the portrait. The head is usually turned slightly to the right or to the left in relationship to the rest of the body. This gives the figure a much more dynamic effect usually and complements sculpture's great strength of existing in three-dimensional space. It forces us to, or invites us to rather, walk around the work and observe it from many places in the room. If you watch the videos I've made on portraiture, then you'll know that we start portraits by building the profile of the head from the side view. To get a side view of the head, we usually can't continue to observe from the four views that we originally started from. Those four views using the front plane of the pelvis as its origin, of course. Our sculpture's head is turned slightly to the left, We therefore have to move to a new set of views to observe from when attempting to observe the head on equal terms. This also does allow for control of your sculpture in relationship to any reference you might be observing from. The famous example that is often brought forth to show this technique off is the drawing by Michelangelo of the Libyan Sibyl from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. If you look at the relationship between the pelvis and the ribcage here, it's clear that very likely nobody can turn around to the extent that this model is turning around, or twisting if you will. And you can try this action for yourself and see how it feels to do so. So if it's impossible for anyone to do it, how did he pull it off in the drawing? Now perhaps it was from imagination, but I think this drawing has certain qualities that leads me to believe that this was drawn from life. So in order to pull off this level of rotation, or twist, which it's often called, between the pelvis and the ribcage, I think Michelangelo would have had to draw the pelvis from one spot in the room, keep the model in the same spot, but then move himself to the right or to the left a little bit, likely to the right in this scenario, and then draw the ribcage separately. The connection between the two can then be made using anatomical knowledge, as it's a very flexible connection made with muscles to begin with. We can do the same thing in sculpture, of course. We can observe each part on equal terms on its own and connect them using what we know about anatomy. There is a danger in all of this, of course, in that your work can start looking really weird and disconnected if you can't create those connections convincingly. It's certainly a more advanced technique, but observing the balance leg and the head on their own equal terms, which differ from the equal terms used on the body, is a pretty good place to start down this road of taking control of your work when working from life or from reference. No longer are you a passive observer, but an active participant that is making choices about your own work. Now, I wouldn't take it too far, especially in the beginning. It can be very tempting to use this trick on every single finger or every single joint of every finger, for example, but it's better to try and keep things somewhat simple, I think, and add layers of complexity as we gain experience. And as we gain experience, we'll be a little bit better suited to making the decision of when an element of the body needs to be observed on equal terms on its own. I went with my friend Sandeep, who some of you might know from one of my early vlogs, to an exhibition at the Palazzo Strozzi here in Florence last summer. The exhibit was on Donatello, and one of the things that we noticed and really liked about his work, well, there were certainly many things, of course, but one thing that comes to mind is that in a lot of his marbles, he had one foot, the balanced leg foot, hang over the edge of the base. This had the effect of making it look like his figures were ready to step off their small bases and walk off into the real world. The effect was rather uncanny, and I was very surprised to see how much such a small thing added to the pieces. Here is the piece in which we noticed it the most. It's the young St. John the Baptist. Notice how the balanced leg foot hangs over the edge of the base. I have to say that photos does not do this piece justice at all, and when at the exhibit, the lighting and the setting really made me fall in love with this sculpture. Here is the perhaps more famous Donatello David, which you can find at the Bargello here in Florence. The same thing is occurring where one foot, the balanced leg foot, floats at the edge of the base. Here is another Donatello, a less famous David, Marble David, with the same thing, where the same thing is happening with the balanced leg foot. These marble sculptures were actually incredible in real life in a properly lit exhibition room. And usually I'm not the biggest fan of Donatello, but I must say I did adore these two marble pieces. It certainly highlighted to me how much setting and lighting matters for sculpture and how they appear to us, and how often photographs of sculpture that you find online has terrible lighting.